Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm loving the turnout that we have. My name's Bex. I am an admin assistant for the Black and African American Cultural Center. And so the BAACC and BRIFT are partnering today to bring the wonderful Kristen here to speak with us all today. Um, Let me know if you have any questions or any comments or any kind of concerns, and then we can definitely go through that. There is a private messaging option, so if you have any personal or sensitive information that you might want to ask Kristen herself, you can direct message, or you can direct message me, and we can keep track of that. So, yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Freeman because Freeman is the whole reason that she's here today, which we love. So take it away, Mr. Freeman.
Hello, my name is Dr. Sidney Freeman Jr. I'm faculty in the College of Education, Health, and Human Sciences here at the University of Idaho. And I'm so excited to have Dr. Clayton with us. I had the opportunity to read her groundbreaking article in the Sociology of Education journal that talked about biracial identity development at historically white institutions and historically Black colleges and universities. And because of the needs that we have in our on our particular campus, we have quite a few biracial students, and it being Black History Month, I thought it was appropriate that we invite the best of the best to speak to our campus about ways we can best support those students and those students who may be interested in learning about their identity and how they navigate that in a space like the University of Idaho. And so we are so elated to have Dr. Clayton with us all the way from Georgia, and looking forward to what she shares with us today. And glad that this will be recorded so that those who were not able to be here today will have the opportunity. Also, I want to thank in advance. I want to thank in advance the BAACC, the Black and African American Cultural Center here on campus for helping to facilitate this under leadership of Mario Powell and also Bex, who did the initial introduction. And also, I need to shout out my particular unit, the Black Research Institute for Flourishing and Thriving, for assisting in putting this together. So without further ado, you didn't come to hear from me. I'm going to turn it over to Bex to introduce Dr. Clayton, and we'll go on from there. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman. So Dr. Clayton here has a master's, bachelor's, and PhD all in sociology, which is beautiful, definitely for the people. I love the fact that we have her here speaking today. Being biracial myself, I'm always trying to figure out where that line is of Black and or white, Irish and or African. And so I'm really excited to hear everything that she has today. I peeped a little bit at a presentation that we're going to have, which I love. So also a director of diversity and inclusion. So thank you for that as well. But like Freeman said, you didn't come here to talk to either of us. You came here to talk to Dr. Clayton. So take it away, Dr. Clayton.
Thank you so much, Bex and Sydney, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thanks for the introduction. As you all just heard, my name is Kristen Clayton, and I currently am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Friends School of Atlanta. And prior to taking this role, I worked in higher ed as an assistant professor of sociology at Oglethorpe University, which is also in Atlanta. And as you know, today I will be talking about some of my research on biracial identity development. I am going to go ahead and share my slides, so just bear with me for a second as I pull those up. All right, can everybody see it? Okay, yeah. All right.
Yes, looks good.
All right, thank you, Beck. So today I'll be talking about biracial identity development at historically white and historically Black colleges and universities. Throughout my presentation, you'll hear me use a couple acronyms, so I just want to take a moment to explain those. I will be saying HBCU and HWCU. So HWCU stands for Historically White College and University. And this refers to schools with stories, histories, traditions, symbols, icons, curriculums, and processes that were all designed by white people for white people at the exclusion of others who since the 1950s and 1960s have been allowed in such spaces. Symbolically, the whiteness of HWCUs is reflected in the traditions that were created prior to integration, thus reflecting the tastes of white people. The whiteness of HWCUs can also be reflected in pictures and statues on campuses, many of which depict white men with racist backgrounds. The student body at most HWCUs remains predominantly white despite attempts at integration. And these universities and colleges are often characterized by a mismatch, where on the one hand, they espouse a belief in diversity, but on the other hand, they remain structurally white institutions. So I'll be talking about HWCUs as one category of institutions and comparing that to HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. So the term HBCU refers to schools created in the 1960s or prior to educate Black students in a segregated society that largely prevented Black students from being able to attend white institutions. HBCU's missions often focus on maintaining Black historical and cultural traditions and producing graduates who can address race relations and work for the betterment of Black communities. The curriculum at HBCUs highlights Black history and culture, reflecting HBCU's historic function as repositories of diaspora history and the history of social hostility. So that's just a little bit of context so that you understand the different types of institutions I'm talking about throughout the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my research that explores the following question. How do Black, white, biracial students' racial identities change throughout college? And how are these changes related to institutional context? So why is this important? Why should we study biracial college students' identity development? Well, for one, college is an important time for identity development. Many college students are between the ages of 18 and 25, which in social psychology is often referred to as a period of emerging adulthood, where individuals are transitioning from adolescence to adulthood and exploring their identity, exploring possible selves. And then for students of color, racial identity is an important part of overall identity development. And racial identity has implications for students' socio-emotional well-being, as well as their academic success. All right, so what do we already know about this topic? So there is a growing body of research that has explored biracial identity development. And what we've learned from previous studies is that individuals who are biracial can identify in various ways. And I should say that today I'm talking specifically about Black, white, biracial individuals. And in my study, I looked specifically at individuals who had one Black and one white biological parent. And past research exploring the identities of this group has shown that individuals can identify in various ways. Here on the screen is the continuum of biracial identity model, sometimes called the Kobe model, which was developed by Rockamore and Laszloffy. And they found that some people who were Black, white, biracial identified singularly with Blackness, some identified singularly with whiteness, but most identified in a more blended way, where they didn't see themselves as exclusively Black or white, but had a blended identity where they might lean more toward identifying with Blackness or whiteness, but they saw themselves as some combination of both. We also know that the way that a biracial individual identifies is influenced by social factors, including but not limited to where they live, so region of the country, if we're looking at the United States, racial composition of your neighborhood, family socialization, so what messages your family sends about how you should identify, strength of relationship with family members, experiences of racism or discrimination, socioeconomic status can play a role in how individuals identify, as well as reflected appraisals. So I'll be talking more about reflected appraisals later, but for those of you who may not have heard the term, it just refers to how you think other people see you. So if you think other people see you as Black, or as white, or as biracial, that can influence how you then see yourself. So we know, again, that biracial identity can change over time. It can also change across context. So what do we know specifically about how college can affect biracial identity? So previous research has explored multiracial identity and experiences within HWCUs, historically white colleges and universities. And this research has found different things. So some studies suggest that HWCUs may lead biracial students to develop a stronger Black identity, whether that's because they have taken racial studies courses, whether that's because they have a growing awareness of segregation or marginalization on campus that then leads them to identify more strongly with Blackness, or perhaps in their HWCU environment, they encounter Black peers who encourage them to participate in Black student organizations. All of these factors could lead biracial individuals to develop a stronger Black identity during college. Or alternatively, encountering peers on campus who identify as multiracial or being exposed to multiracial student groups on campus could cause multiracial students to develop a stronger multiracial identity during their college experience. So studies have found different things. There is not that much research looking at biracial experiences or biracial identity within HBCUs. And the research that I found prior to conducting my own research that did look at racial identity within HBCUs, it didn't really look at mixed race or multiracial students. Most of the research focused on monoracial students' racial identity at HBCUs. So if we look at studies on Black racial identity within HBCUs, there are some studies that said, oh, well, it doesn't really matter that much whether a Black student attends an HBCU or an HWC. We're not really seeing very much differential effect on their racial identity development. Regardless of institutional context, most Black students in these studies had strong Black identities. Other studies said that, or found that a lot of Black students who selected HBCUs did so because of the racial focus of the school and because they wanted to intentionally explore their racial identity in more depth. So that suggests that Black students who select HBCUs may develop a stronger Black identity because they have intentionally sought out to do so, and that's part of the reason why they chose the school. And again, this is past research on monoracial Black students at HBCUs. There is also some, not a lot, but some research on the experience of white, Latinx, and Asian HBCU students. So non-Black students who choose to go to historically Black colleges and universities. And this research suggests that these students may develop a heightened sense of racial otherness. So they feel different in comparison to Black peers. They could also develop an increased appreciation for diversity, increased understanding of racism, and diminishing racial prejudice. So like I said, there's really not a lot of existing research that looks at mixed race or biracial HBCU students' experiences. So if we're trying to kind of hypothesize this qualitative research, so we don't really hypothesize, but if we're trying to think about, well, how might biracial students' experience in an HBCU impact their identity, we can kind of look at the existing research on white, Latinx, Asian, and Black students to try to come up with some ideas. So similar to monoracial Black students, biracial Black students may choose to go to an HBCU because they intentionally want to explore their Blackness. And if that's the case, we might expect that their experience in the HBCU could lead to a stronger Black identity. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, HBCU's curriculum emphasizes Black history and Black culture. And so that academic exploration of Black history could lead to a stronger Black identity. Or it could also be the case that biracial students who go to HBCUs develop a stronger biracial or white identity due to an increased sense of racial otherness, similar to monoracial white students who go to HBCUs or Latinx or Asian students. So again, we don't really know, or we didn't really know that much. There wasn't a lot of research. All right, so what are the gaps in the literature that I was hoping to fill? As I mentioned, most previous studies focused on multiracial students' experiences in predominantly or historically white institutions. There's not really a lot of research on multiracial students' experiences in minority-serving institutions like HBCUs. And most previous studies were cross-sectional. So most previous studies only surveyed or interviewed people at one point in time. And so that prevents a full understanding of racial identity development. And so my study is longitudinal. So I interviewed people over time at the beginning and at the end of their college career to better understand the processes of racial identity development. So I interviewed 49 Black, white, biracial underclassmen, freshmen, sophomores, who attended an HBCU or an HWCU. And as I said, I followed up with them again and did a second interview at the end of their college career. Initial interviews were conducted in 2013 and 2014, and then the follow-up interviews were conducted between 2016 and 2018. On average, there was a little bit less than 3 years in between the initial and the follow-up interview. I recruited from 4 different schools. I recruited from one historically white college or university. This was a public research university in the Southeast. It enrolled more than 26,000 undergraduate students. I'm going to give you just a little bit of context about the school to help you understand the setting where I was conducting these interviews. So 37% of undergraduates, including all first-year students, lived on campus. The university has a long history of racial exclusion. It was founded in the 1780s, but did not admit Black students until the 1960s. When the study began, about 73% of students were white, about 7.5% were Black, and 3% were multiracial. Among full-time instructional faculty, 78% were white, and only 6% were Black. So this is a predominantly and historically white university. Also notably during the study, the school was in the news multiple times for racist incidents, either within the university itself or within the surrounding college town. I recruited from 3 HBCUs in order to get enough participants. The HBCUs were smaller, so it was necessary to recruit from all 3. They were also located in the southeastern United States. They are private schools. 2 are liberal arts colleges serving only undergraduates, and 1 is a research institution serving undergraduate and graduate students. On average, the interviews lasted about 83 minutes. So I used semi-structured interviews, which allowed participants to expand on topics or take the interview in sometimes unexpected directions, but I did at least ask a set of questions on racial identity to all participants, and I asked the same questions at time 1 and at time 2 during the follow-up interview. So some of these questions include, how strongly do you identify with being Black compared to how strongly you identify with being white? What do you write on forms that ask about your race? Does how you identify racially depend on context? Imagine you're at a multicultural retreat where you are asked to split into groups with people of your same race. What would you do? And then at time 2, so in the follow-up interview, I also asked, thinking about how you identified racially on your first day of college and thinking about how you identify now, would you say there's been any change? So this allowed me to understand participants' perception of identity change, which was not always consistent with their actual noted identity change. So that was interesting as well. In terms of analysis, I compared individual data across time. So for each participant, I transcribed and then closely read and coded their interview at time 1, compared that to their interview at time 2. And because I asked the same questions at both times, I could see if there had been a change. And then I also looked for trends within and across institutions so that I could better understand how institutional context was related to biracial identity development. All right, so now let's get into the findings. So what I found is that students at both institutional types, so at HBCUs and the HWCU, often developed stronger Black identities during college. So this was not always the case, but this was the trend for both types of institutions. So if you look here for HBCU participants, at time one, most, so a little bit more than half, about 58%, identified more strongly with Blackness than with whiteness. So if you remember that Kobe model previously that showed that you could identify singularly with whiteness, singularly with Blackness in the middle, or you could kind of lean in one direction or the other. So a little more than half were leaning toward a stronger Black identity. And then if you look at time two, this had increased to about 3/4 of participants, so about 74%. So from time one to time two, you have several participants, a notable number of participants shifting toward a stronger Black identity. And then if you look at those who identified more strongly with whiteness, only one identified more strongly with whiteness at time one, and by time two, no one did. And there's also a decrease in the percentage identifying evenly with both, right? So this is a trend toward developing stronger Black identities. And you can see the same trend with HWCU participants. So at time one, there's kind of a mix here, right? You have 40% of historically white college students in the sample identifying evenly with whiteness and Blackness, and then about a third, like 30%, more strongly identifying with whiteness and 30% more strongly identifying with Blackness. But then at time two, so when I followed up with them at the end of their college career, there's an increase in the number who are more strongly identifying with Blackness and a decrease in the number who are more strongly identifying with whiteness. So you will go from 30% to 10%, and here there's an increase 30% to 50%. So similar trends across institutional type. So here's some quotes to just kind of illustrate that. So Isaac attended an HBCU, and these are all pseudonyms, these are not real names. So sophomore year, Isaac said, I see myself as 50-50, Black-white. But by senior year, he said, I identify as Black. So Isaac shifted from a more blended 50-50 identity toward almost a singular Black identity from sophomore to senior year at his HBCU. Skylar attended an HWCU, historically white college. And at time one, she said, I identify with my white half more than the Black half. Whereas at time two, she said, she identified as probably more Black than white. So this is another example of that shift toward a stronger Black identity during college. Okay, so why? We see that students at both types of institutions are often, not always, but often developing stronger Black identities. Why is this the case? So my research also explored mechanisms that can help explain why many students develop stronger Black identities throughout college. So let's talk about some of those. One factor that played a role in this identity change was increasing awareness of racism. So respondents often followed a similar trajectory of identity development where an increasing understanding of racism led to stronger Black identities. But the processes that led to that increasing awareness of racism differed by institution. So at HBCUs, students were developing increasing awareness of racism through their coursework. So for instance, Isaac, we just saw a quote from Isaac on the previous slide talking about or showing his strength in Black identity. He also talked about how classes really focused on Black empowerment and Black history. So he said, in every class, it could be African American studies or it could be calculus. The professor will go off on a Black empowerment episode talking about how we're being oppressed and how as African Americans, it's our job to fight the stigmas that we face. HWCU students were also often developing an increasing awareness of racism, but it wasn't really happening that often through academic coursework. 1/3 of HWCU respondents said race was a notable theme in their academic studies, but most, 2/3 of respondents did not really encounter frequent or any academic discussions of race. So instead, Their developing awareness of racism was related to either personal experiences of racism or discrimination on campus or broader conversations in the national discourse. So during the time of the study, we see Trump's election. There was also increasing attention to Black Lives Matter during that period, so that influenced HWCU students' understandings of racism, and then their own identities. So as an example, Skylar says, I've become more woke to learn about maybe different things that affected the Black community that then you can identify with. Being disadvantaged already when it comes to relationships with your professors because they may not be like you. I have a bunch of white Southern conservative professors, men, and having to do twice as good to be considered on the same level of your peers that are more along the same lines that they are. So here, Skylar's classes were influencing her racial identity, but it was because of her perception of racism in the classroom, right? Double standards for evaluating the work of white students compared to students of color. And so it was this perception of racism in the classroom, not the content of her classes, that was influencing her racial identity. All right, so in addition to an increasing understanding of racism, reflected appraisals also help explain why so many students shifted towards stronger Black identities. But again, the process was different depending on institutional types. So at HBCUs, biracial students talked about reflected appraisals in terms of feeling included as Black by their peers and their professors. So remember, reflected appraisal is how I think you view me. All right, so how I think you see me in terms of race is likely going to have some effect on how I view myself. And so for biracial HBCU students, they often believe, my peers, my professors, they see me as one of them. They see me as Black, and this could lead to a stronger Black identity. So for instance, Tori said, the professors will say like us and like we or like you as Black women. Quentin said, you walk into a classroom and everyone's Black. I imagine that's pretty striking to anyone who's not in that environment themselves. And the one thing that would be at the end of each realization or each time I noticed it would be like, well, I'm in here too and no one said anything, so obviously I belong here. Right, so both of these quotes illustrate the process of reflected appraisals, feeling included as part of the group in Black spaces, leading to a strengthened Black identity. So HWCU students also talked about reflected appraisals, but they often talked about being excluded from whiteness. So they were often talking about how their white peers and their white professors viewed them as part of the out group and how this led to a strengthening Black identity. So for instance, at time 2, Brooke said, freshman year, I was very much like, I'm a biracial woman. This is me. This is how I identify. Then in the context of being in college and being in a predominantly white institution, you realize that the majority and the people that I think that are in a position of power, they don't necessarily view you as being biracial. They just see you as a person of color. They see you as a minority. In that context, in the context of the majority, I identify as a Black woman more now. So another example of reflected appraisals comes from this quote from Monique. She was friends with Brooke. They were both biracial, attending the HWCU. I interviewed both of them. And at time 1, Monique was talking about Greek life. And she said, the thing with the Black sororities is that they have to choose you. And unfortunately, me and Brooke don't look Black. So I feel like that would be really hard for them to choose us to be in their sorority. And then on the other hand, the sororities on the white side, me and Brooke feel like they would choose us. Interestingly, at time 2, Monique and Brooke were both in a Black sorority. And when talking about this, Monique said they, predominantly white sororities, are not accepting of Black people. They are stereotypical, just like the bars downtown. And so you can see here this change in the way that she thinks other people view her and whether other people include her, right? So at time 1, she believed she wasn't really viewed as Black, so it'd be hard for her to be recruited by a Black sorority, and that, you know, she would be welcomed and included by white peers. And then by time 2, you see a pretty notable change in her perspective, where she no longer feels that she is viewed as part of the in-group among white peers and has actually joined a Black Greek organization. And the last factor that I'm going to highlight that I noted played a role in explaining biracial identity development was increased contact with Black peers. So at HBCUs, it was necessary to have contact with Black peers. So almost everyone who attends an HBCU is Black. And so the biracial respondents had frequent contact with Black peers. And for some of them, this was a very new experience. A lot of them came from predominantly white neighborhoods, predominantly white high schools. Some of them had never been immersed in a predominantly Black space. And this increased contact and familiarity with Black people often led to a strengthened Black identity. So Cody, for instance, said that his strengthened Black identity is a response, I guess, from being around Black people. And similarly, Leah said her strengthened Black identity is just about the people I surround myself with. At the HWCU, people, some of my respondents didn't really have sustained contact with Black peers because such a small percentage of the student population was Black. But for individuals who did choose to seek out Black student organizations or be a part of the Black campus community, this often led to a strengthened Black identity through increased contact with Black peers. So for instance, Shayla talks about the effects of going to a multicultural retreat on her racial identity. She said, before the retreat, I identified as mixed race. Then the retreat made me want to identify more as a Black female. The environment of the retreat made me realize that I have a lot of things in common with Black people who are just strictly African American. I wanted to be sympathetic to the issues that we face, the issue of hair, of colorism, housing discrimination, job discrimination. All right, so conclusions. So I found that regardless of institutional type, students often develop stronger Black identities from the time they started, the time they finished college. But as I have highlighted, the process of Black identity development differed depending on institutional type, and process matters. Okay, why does process matter? I'm about to put up a lot of words, so just bear with me. So we know from previous research that students who take courses about race may experience more positive racial identity development, accompanied by a greater sense of racial pride and an improved ability to navigate racism. HBCU students are more likely than HWCU students to study race. And so it's possible and probable that biracial HBCU students may graduate with more pride in their Blackness and a better ability to navigate racially hostile environments. So my research also shows that some biracial HWCU students are developing an understanding of themselves as Black, largely due to racism. Right? So they're experiencing racism on campus, they're feeling excluded. So this is leading to a stronger sense of themselves as Black, but they don't necessarily have positive campus spaces where they can process these experiences with other students of color. So most of my respondents were not part of Black student organizations or multicultural student organizations. So they didn't necessarily have that space to process these challenging experiences. And in such situations, students may experience negative psychosocial development, adjustment issues, or attrition. They may leave college. Notably, 3 HWCU students withdrew from college during the study. So I still interviewed them, but they did not complete their time at the HWCU. And 2 of the 3 students cited negative campus race relations as a contributing factor for why they withdrew from their university. So overall, the findings suggest that although biracial students at HBCUs and HWCUs may similarly develop stronger Black identities during college, the processes by which they develop this stronger Black identity is different. And it may be more positive for HBCU students than it is for HWCU students. So for HBCU students, a strengthened Black identity was often related to a sense of inclusion in Black communities and a growing sense of Black pride. Whereas, as I mentioned, for HWCU students, their strengthening Black identity was often related to experiences of racial exclusion or marginalization on campus. So this study contributes to understanding of biracial identity development, primarily by including students at HBCUs, which, as I mentioned, have not really received a lot of attention in the higher education literature. And my study also contributed to knowledge by using a longitudinal approach, which allowed me to kind of see identity development over time. But that does not mean it's not without its limitations. So one limitation of the study is there was not a lot of gender diversity. Most of my respondents were women. So I wasn't able to fully explore the ways that gender may influence biracial identity development. And the study only focused on students attending college in the southeastern United States. So it is very likely that identity development may look different in other regions with different racial history and different contemporary patterns of race relations. All right, so that is what I have for you today. Thank you for listening, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Hi, thank you, Dr. King. That was amazing. I really enjoyed everything that you were talking about. Being a freshman, I'm sorry, being a transfer student, I'm from San Diego myself. So I grew up in a real biracial environment, and then coming to Idaho was a real culture shock, I would say, to the white side of my how I identify. And then being part of BAACC and helping out Brift and tapping into embracing the Black culture side of how I identify definitely allowed me to feel more comfortable with that within myself. And I still definitely struggle with how others view me and my Blackness, but I can definitely say that I do lean more towards identifying as Black now, as when I first got here a couple of years ago, I was definitely as white as can be. So I definitely agree with everything that you found, and I'm excited to see more research that you have because I'm touched. I think that's great. I really do.
Thank you, Bex. Thank you for sharing your experiences as well.
Mhm.
I have a question. So, I feel like I found my people because I actually transferred to Washington State University from San Diego State University my sophomore year, and I came here for athletics. I was a rower. I was the only African American on my entire team of over 60 women, and I'm mixed. So, I did always receive a lot of, oh, well, you can't be a token because you're not even fully Black, you're white, stuff like that. And I've never not felt Black because I know I'm Black. I've always been treated Black. I'm Black passing. I've always been identified as Black. But growing up with my white mom, I've never been able to walk around and be associated with her ever. And in fact, I have four little brothers. Two of them are biracial, same dad, same mom. And they would even get like accused of stealing like her purse and stuff just from touching the cart that she would have in a store when she told us to like meet us in a different aisle, stuff like that. And I've grown up with those situations all the time. And my poor mother, she had to deal with that too. But as a white woman, I feel like she really stepped up and into her position and understanding that although she doesn't go through the same things that we do, she does through us. But I'm also the Black Student Union president here at WSU. So I've recently faced a little bit of you know, unsettling comments or anything because some people have a problem with, my whiteness. Um, I have felt a lot more in tune, like you stated previously, with my Blackness ever since being immersed within the Black Student Union. It's been very healing. It's been all the things that I need to be the woman that I know I'm supposed to be. And that is from surrounding myself like the HBCU experiences, and that is from getting involved and going and searching for connections. And actually, Dr. Samuels is one of my biggest mentors, and she's taught me a lot about being a biracial woman and navigating it in this environment. But what would you say from your research? Like, how would you go about or conduct like a conversation when you're in that spotlight of, oh, you shouldn't be the Black Student Union president, you're white, or you shouldn't be the one representing us, or I've also experienced you've only achieved what you've achieved because you are white or because you're lighter skin. That's the only reason why they listen to you, that kind of tone and energy towards me. So like, well, how would you conduct that conversation or go about that conversation? Because I am understanding of both sides. I'm completely understanding of not agreeing or not liking people because they're lighter skin because it's historical. that they've been treated better, they've been had the upper hand. It's true, but I don't think that we should all be put in that category of kind of like arrogancy and like of our lighter skin, because that's not the case. It's not the case whatsoever. So like my question is, sorry, I'm super excited to be able to be involved in this conversation and have, you know, like-minded people and understanding. Also hearing like the San Diego transfers, I love to hear it too. So represent.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing your experiences as well, and for that question. It is a little bit hard to answer, right? So how would I recommend having that conversation with the person? So I would be curious to know if you've tried to have conversations with individuals who have, you know, suggested that you only have your position due to your biracial background or your light skin color, and how that went. Have you tried having any of those conversations?
No,
No.
no.
Okay. Yeah, and so I feel like I'm in a director of DEI role, right? So I feel like I can see myself trying to put that hat on to think about how I would actually practically address that from like a DEI practitioner perspective. But then from a research perspective, I have thoughts as well. So um, what you're explaining or what you're describing was something that did come up fairly frequently in my interviews, especially the interviews with people who were at the HBCU. And so I have a different paper that explores kind of identity work. And so the strategies that people tried to use to kind of distance themselves from those accusations of like elitism or being stuck up, right? And people tried a variety of different strategies to distance themselves from that with differing levels of success. But I think one of the important pieces is to just have the conversations, right? And to have honest, open conversations about colorism, right? Because colorism is a real thing, right? And so a lot of my participants were like, yeah, I do sometimes get these accusations, but a lot of them were aware of the history of colorism. So, you know, lighter skinned people being privileged, even within the Black community. And so this, I think just having the conversations and being aware of the history, being aware of how that plays out, and then just being authentic. And I think most people found that, you know, they were able to overcome that. Like it wasn't most people who I interviewed talked about, you know, maybe occasional comments, right, along those lines, but they were still able to form relationships or have leadership positions. Sorry, someone is calling me. I'm just going to ignore that. Have leadership positions in Black student organizations and kind of overcome some of those challenges related to colorism. I don't know if that answers your question at all. Do you have does it help to kind of answer?
I completely get like the stay authentic, always stay true to what you are trying to achieve and to yourself. So that makes a lot of sense. There's just I haven't experienced a increased amount of hate or any like it's been, you know, and which is why I have never needed to confront it before, because it's never been that kind of situation where, you know, anybody is willing to say it out loud or to my face, or it's just little things here and there that you know get, that all of us have experienced, that are in the same boat of just hearing it, or that it's been a topic of conversation. But one thing that is on our program, our upcoming program, we're trying to do a less of a debate, but just some topics of the different experiences of Africans, African Americans, and mixed African Americans. So we're going to have a person from each identity, and I'm on that panel to have this open discussion on our experiences and African versus African American versus Black, yada yada, you know, get into that topic. So I will be, you know, taking a lot of this in with me into those conversations and trying to stay authentic. One of the things is, like you said, elitism. Like that's always what we're considered of, like trying to pass off as is elitism, and it's not. And it's also, we're always trying to find our identity and use the Black community to find our identity. And I don't agree with that. Like we're searching for ourselves like through that. And like for me, it has been a healing experience to be more connected or to see that side of me, because I didn't grow up in it necessarily, but I don't think I use it to like search for, you know, I don't know how to explain that, but I feel like people might get me a little bit.
Yeah, I think what you're expressing is, a common sentiment and, a common challenge of having to navigate, colorism. And I think just having the conversations, like I said, and just trying to share your experiences, learn from other people's experiences, they can learn from your experiences, and just try to understand each other better as, individuals can kind of help us to overcome those stereotypes that others might have about us because of our skin color or because of, your biracial background or what have you. So I'm glad that it's been a healing experience being in the group and that you're having these conversations, and thank you for being here. Happy to chat afterwards too if you want to, get my email address and talk more. See a question in the chat. How can academic leaders in organizations help biracial students go through their identity development? Yeah, so one of the things I was rereading some of my other research, because honestly, it's been a little while since I conducted these interviews. So I was trying to just refresh my memory. And in one of the pieces, I was reminded that a lot of the biracial students who went to the historically white college, they didn't want to be part of Black student organizations, or they didn't know if they were allowed to. Some of them legitimately did not know if they were allowed to be in a Black student organization because they were like, well, am I really Black? Can I even join? And so I think making it very clear to students that they are able to join a Black student organization, even if they have a white parent or don't identify fully as Black or they identify as biracial, would be one thing that academic leaders or people who work in student affairs could do. And then I think having multiracial student organizations or organizations for mixed race students or just for diverse students could also be useful for those students who are maybe hesitant to join a Black organization because they either don't know if they can or they're not quite sure that that's the best cultural fit for them. Having some option with people of color where they can kind of talk through and process challenging experiences or experiences with racism on campus would be one helpful thing. And then thinking through the academic cultures so that students are actually engaging with academic content on race and racism. Because at the historically white college, as I said, most students did not encounter academic discussions of race, only certain majors, right? So like if I had a sociology major, they would talk about it, right? But if I had like an econ major or an agricultural science major at the HWCU, they may not be encountering anything around race. And so we know that having academic study of race and racism can be useful. It could actually lead to increased racial pride, and it can actually better equip students to understand and respond to racist encounters if they happen. And if you don't have any of that, and a lot of biracial students were raised by white mothers, and a lot of the white mothers emphasized colorblind racial socialization practices. So they did not really equip their children to understand racism. And so they were very unprepared, or they weren't even expecting to encounter it, and they didn't have the tools to do so. So thinking through academic requirements and maybe requiring courses on race or racism, and then thinking through student support through organizations can help equip students with those tools that they may not have received from their homes. I hope that answers your question, Sydney.
Yes, thank you. I have questions, but I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak.
I kind of had a question. First, I'd like to say that I really find this research very interesting, especially with the perception of being biracial myself. I wanted to know, within those interviews, did you notice an incline of like mental health and confidence when you were having those interviews and those students kind of change like their identity of like identifying more with their whatever side that they chose to identify after embracing their culture or being within those spaces? Like you talked about some students were coming from predominantly white spaces and then having the chance to come into somewhere that was predominantly Black.
Yeah, so just to make sure I understand your question, were you asking if I noticed any impacts of their changing racial identity on their mental health or confidence.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so mental health, so I didn't like really focus too much on that. I know I talked about implications of my research on mental health, but I didn't actually ask any questions that would explicitly tap into that, right? Or like give them any sort of assessments or anything. That would have been really interesting. Maybe a future study could do something like that. In terms of, well, the one thing I will say about that though, is I have another paper that explores racial regard, which is a component of racial identity that taps into like your feelings about your membership in your racial group. So like pride or shame. And I did see that, especially for HBCU students, there was often an improvement in their racial regard. So they felt better about being Black, right? So as they developed stronger Black identities, they also felt more pride. And so that is directly related to mental health because, you know, if you identify as Black or at least part Black, and you are also holding negative stereotypes about Blackness, and you feel bad or kind of ashamed about your Black background, then that's internalized racism. And there's a lot of literature showing that that's associated with negative physical health symptoms as well as mental health, and increased substance abuse as well. And so, so now that I'm like talking out loud and thinking through your question, yes, right? So those who did develop stronger Black identities, when that was accompanied also by improved racial regard, then that has negative impacts on your mental health. And you know, maybe surprisingly, maybe not. A lot of people at time one had internalized racism. People were saying things in these interviews that you know, suggested that they did have some negative feelings about Blackness. And fortunately, especially at the HBCUs, but also sometimes at the HWCU, I saw that decrease over time.
Awesome, thank you. And then you said you had a paper about racial regard. I would love to be able to look that up. Do you have it published?
Yeah, so that is in the journal Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. And I think that was published in 2019. I can also try to send it over to Sydney or Bex afterwards in case anyone's interested in that and you can't locate it.
Awesome, thank you.
Could you shoot that over to Dr. Samuels as well for us WSU heads over here?
Dr. Samuels, yes, let me just get
Thank you.
the full name. Okay, so I see another question in the chat. Do you think that only faculty of color would be helpful or prepared to hold or open conversations on race in classroom settings? I know it probably depends, but what do you think generally? No, I wouldn't say so. I would say, you know, I had several classes as a, you know, sociology undergraduate student that were taught by white faculty members who I thought, you know, were helpful and prepared to hold those conversations. Did they always say everything right? No. But were they for the most part prepared and capable of having those conversations? I would say yes. So I think having more conversations is good. Right? We need to talk more about race than we do, I think. Okay, another question in the chat. I'm thinking about the implications of your work for the mostly female identifying teacher education students at our institution. I wonder about whether you observed ways that racial identity development manifests uniquely related to gender, particularly at HWCUs. All right, so how racial identity development is related to gender, I think is the question. So yes, gender was relevant. As I mentioned, most of the respondents, most of the participants who I interviewed did identify as women. And so there wasn't a ton of gender variation, but women's experiences at the HWCU, let me think about this for a minute. Most of the people I interviewed were also heterosexual. So they were interested in dating men, and a lot of them were interested in dating white men, especially at time one. That was another thing that changed over time, where, you know, from time one to time two, there was often, along with it, a stronger Black identity. There was a more openness or desire to date Black men. Whereas at time one, a lot of people at the HWCU came in leaning toward whiteness or identifying equally with Blackness and whiteness and gravitating toward white men, and not always feeling like they were treated well in like the dating scene. So people talked about like trying to straighten their hair or do different things to navigate like predominantly white dating scenes and try to attract a white male partner. I don't know if that answers your question as you're thinking about female identifying teacher education students, but that was just one example of the way that gender and sexual orientation, you know, kind of intersected with race to influence individuals' experiences. Who asked that? Rebecca, did that help answer your question, or were you thinking something different? I can't hear you. Sound issue. Oh, I think I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I think about it, but I know that we do support cohorts of biracial and Indigenous teacher education students in particular. And for those scholars in, you know, a gendered profession, as it is right now, especially in elementary ed, I'm just wondering about the implications of like, what are their experiences like? And especially knowing that a lot of your research showed that the thing that will strengthen racial identity is, you know, adverse experiences at a historically white college and institution and sort of a lack of intentional coursework. Just thinking about what are some of the implications or ways that I can be paying attention, be supporting those students throughout the program, especially as a, you know, as a white person who doesn't share their racial experience or identity.
Yeah, and what did you say your role was?
So I'm the director of field placement, which is like I help folks get out into classrooms a lot, and then I also teach social studies methods for teacher ed students and do research around the ways that youth in this area experience race and racism. And that's part of a rural youth research collaborative where actually the young people are the ones that are sort of guiding those questions. So a variety of roles.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I think in terms of supporting the students, it sounds like you're doing some things that my research would recommend, right? Through having intentional coursework, right? That explores race. You just mentioned some of that in like social studies methods, education for teachers. So I think like any kind of teacher program should definitely be having frequent and explicit conversations about race, right? And how that affects teacher experiences, student experiences. I work now in a pre-K through 8th grade school, and there are like things related to race popping up all the time. And teachers have vastly different levels of preparation for dealing with it. So, you know, having those conversations in teacher preparation programs, I think is useful for everyone, regardless of their racial background or their gender. But it's a good question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Sydney, is fine if you share my email in the chat. I saw you type that into the chat.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I want to know if there's any more questions because we are at time. No, all right. So it looks like Freeman is putting, oh, yep, Clayton's email is in the chat. And Dr. Samuels, I did forward you her research. So please feel free to forward that to any of your students because we definitely would love that. I wanted to thank you, Dr. Clayton, for participating and showing us your research. I love this, and I'm so glad we recorded it because I'm definitely going to watch it again and resonate it for quite a long time. So I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Do
Thank
you
you for
have-
having me.
No, thank you so much for coming. No, I really love it. And then, Dr. Freeman, I wanted to know if you had anything else you would like to.
Yeah, so I just wanted to encourage all of you that we have a plethora of events that are going on this month through the BAACC. I know WSU has some great things going on there also. So please avail yourself of the schedules related to many of the activities. So I believe tonight there is a special activity, right, Bex? There's
Yes, it's called the Elevated Black Voices Panel. So we're going to try to record that as well. And Dr. Clayton, if you'd like a copy, I can send one your way.
yeah.
That'd be
So
great.
yeah, so thank you. We'll try to get her research out to you, but thank you so much everyone for being here with us.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, everyone.
Thank you. Bex and Dr. Freeman, do you need me to stay on?
Well, it'd be nice for her to be introduced to our director.
It's that one. Oh, he's below me. Hi.
Hello, Dr. Clayton. My name is Mario Pyle. It's really great to meet you. Thank you again so much for being here and sharing with us so much wisdom and sharing with your research. It's been very helpful and appreciative.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So that was it. But just thank you so much again. I always say these kinds of things are a dream. Like you think about it, and now it's happened. So we're thankful for you taking the time. I know you're busy, so to take the time was great.
Oh, I appreciate it. It's nice, not being in higher ed anymore. It's nice to come back and have the experience to be able to talk about research again. It's been a while.
Yeah,
So thank you. All
no
right, I hope you
problem.
have a good evening.
The same to you.
Yes, you
Bye.
too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Then it was just us. I'm just kidding. We're still recording. I should stop.
Oh.